Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for the Making Progress channel. Today's video is the upsides and downsides of communism. And it's video number 28. And hopefully there'll be more videos, but if you're curious in this kind of content, I have a bunch of videos sort of related to this stuff earlier in the channel's history. So check that out. Like, subscribe, and tell your friends about me, damn it. All right, it's under controversial issues because gee whiz, this one's going to get some comments going. 4 things to chat about today. First, we're going to try to define terms, so we're on the same page. Second is we're going to talk about the upsides of communism, because it absolutely does have upsides. Then we're going to talk about the downsides of communism. Sure, shit has those. And then the way forward and how to think about this issue, well, remotely, rationally. So defining terms is difficult in this regard. One of the reasons that it's difficult to define terms in discussing communism is there's kind of a constellation of terminology in what I would call hard left political and economic. I struggle to use the term theory, as theory in my definition is a well-confirmed framework of facts supported by evidence. There's not really any of that in here. I would say model. Model's a good thing to say. So the hard left economic and social model uses a lot of terms that are some combination of seemingly not definable, definitions that are greatly overlapping, definitions which various sources have defined differently, and definitions for which it's really hard to pin down exactly what's being discussed, sort of a distinction without a difference kind of thing. So what I would call sort of leftist, hard left linguistics are sort of very unhelpful in this regard because they're mostly, I think, at least in some sense, some of them are kind of architected purposefully to obviate receiving criticism. For example, if you criticize socialism, someone tells you, you're criticizing communism. If you're criticizing communism, someone's like, well, actually, you're talking about socialism, and communism is a lot different. And then there's also this difference in the terminology of communism and socialism as idealized future states versus imposed current policy. It's akin to being like, hey, does this squat exercise look like it has good technique? They would say, well, if you were an Olympic gymnast, it would be good. And ideally, some point you can get to that technique. But right now, it actually is quite terrible. And then you're like, okay, so what exactly is the specific technique of the squat? And I said, well, actually, it depends. And then this huge conversation that ends up kind of going nowhere in that regard. So very, very difficult to get very finite terms out of this conversation to kind of, I suppose, in some sense, hold people to account. Like when you say communism, what do you mean? This is what you mean, yes? Here are the criticisms. There's a lot of times you get, like I said earlier, well, that's actually socialism, and then you don't even know what you're talking about. Sometimes they just don't accept your criticism whatsoever. They don't accept any definitions. You propose a definition on communism or socialism, you'll be in an infinite debate about what they mean, and you'll never get any traction anywhere. This would be an interesting case if it was just that internally and externally there was a lot of consistency in the hard left nomenclature, but I was ignorant to this nomenclature and sort of like, right-wing troll, not so smart person just hand waving away like it's all the same to me, man. It's what my grandfather was doing with his gun back in Korea. God damn it. That's the people he was hurting. That's all I know. There's just fucking everyone's a communist. Like that's just not the case. I consider myself quite well educated, at least from a kind of a dilettante perspective on these matters. And I haven't really seen any internally or externally consistent use of language or much of it in the hard left circles. And a lot of this language is folks that on the hard left will use. You will see it in the comments, I almost guarantee. And it's actually not language that's very accepted or accepted at all or without a huge amount of controversy in mainstream economics. For example, a lot of what you'll hear is about late stage capitalism. That's a common concept that very hard left communist folks talk about, or the socialist folks. I never can tell. And late stage capitalism is one of those things that cannot possibly be well defined. I think it was variously defined by some older theoreticians, folks from 100 years ago. And all of their predictions just didn't come to pass. Now it's looking like capitalism just kind of spreading all over the world and socialism/communism really start to suck. They started to suck generations ago. They're now well past the point of having proven themselves largely ineffectual. So the idea of late stage capitalism is very difficult to pin down exactly what that is. When is the late stage? What happens? What happens next? There's some actual finite predictions of how does the system work and what do you expect it to do next. Very difficult to drag out of folks in this very extreme side of the political aisle. Another term is state capitalism. And so you accuse China of being communist, people will come back and say it's not communism, it's state capitalism. I'm not exactly sure what state capitalism means. Good news, most mainstream economists don't know what it means either, because it's essentially a term that's used almost exclusively by hard left theoreticians and is kind of something, is a deflection term. You got to say anything that's going bad for you is state capitalism. Anything that's going good for you, which really never does, is definitely true socialism or true communism or whatever you have it. I don't like to deal with the linguistics bullshit at all because I've been trying to deal with it for probably about 20 years now, made no sense of it. I don't think it's a thing that is supposed to make sense. This is why mainstream economists are largely not Marxists, because there's a lot of gobbledygook in there that makes no fucking sense at all. So what modern economists do, and what I'm trying to do here, is to define communism more directly in a way that can be empirically verified by data. So I prefer to define communism as, or the spectrum of what is not communism all the way to communism, is the degree of government control of the economy. High degrees of control are more communist. Lower degrees of control are less communist, or more free market. And in this case, because it's communism, because there's other ways of controlling an economy that are not communist. Fascism is one, for example. Communist is a high degree of control of the economy with at least a major purpose of that to have the goal of maximizing wealth redistribution, right? That's what communism is in practice. It's close enough to the theoreticals of communism behind all the jargon that's like, okay, generally as a free economy, communists want to come in and make it not free. It's the only way to work communism, because if you tell people what to do and they just don't do it, you got to have the force of government behind it. So you take control of the government, which is how every single communist revolution works. You get control of the military and the police, and then you impose a rule of law, some kind of will on the people. And at least on paper, that rule of law is imposed to try to take wealth away from the wealthiest people and redistribute it so there's a more even distribution of wealth among all people in society, right? And the good thing is very much on the degree of government control of the economy, and to a large extent, the fraction of government control that goes to try to redistribute wealth is something we can measure in quantitative indices. There are multiple indices. The Heritage Foundation runs an index of economic freedom. The Fraser Institute runs a Freedom of the World index. There's a few others, including social freedom as well, that I'm familiar with. So this is one of these things in which statistics can be done. Economists regularly collect data. They measure where countries are, and it's a spectrum, all the way from very free economies, for example, to very state-run, very controlled economies. And that's a really good proxy for us trying to figure out who's more communist and who's not. Now, some countries, which are very unfree, are also not very communist because they don't have wealth redistribution as a big priority for them. But we can parse those out and stick to countries which ideologically present themselves as left-wing communist socialist countries. That's in their charter, it's in their constitution, what have you. China, for example, they're avowedly a communist country. And we can now measure these countries and see, like, are they really as communist as they say, or significantly more so? And the free countries, they're not just free countries because bald eagles fly over them. They're like, America, God damn it. That's not really freedom. That's just patriotism. It can be applied to any other country. But we can now measure economic freedom so well in all these indices that we can say, like, actually, yes, your claim to being a largely free market country is correct. And as a matter of fact, we can rank you with all the other countries on how that goes. So if you ever want to go to the Index of Economic Freedom, Heritage Foundation is an excellent source. Probably technically biased, a little bit more right-wing than I would ideally love, but it's quite good. There's the Fraser Institute, which is probably more centrist and probably to more folks' liking. You can explore the indices and see what you find. It's actually quite awesome. But there have been, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of technical economic papers written off of these indices and of other more specific indices and various econometric data collected from countries that have various degrees of government control and various degrees of trying to use the government in order to get the income relatively similar among all people, wealth redistribution, income redistribution. So we know a lot about this. We can just go straight to the data. So if you tell me, well, that's not real communism, I'll just say, like, well, it looks like the index of economic freedom is really low, and it looks like they do a lot to try to keep the salaries of various employees similar. So it's actually on a scale of this is totally not communism, and this is the most pure form of communism I've ever tried, your country, whatever that is, sits right here. So it's much more true to say that it's communist than to say that it's not communist. So that is what it is. That's the kind of definition we'll be using here. Now, being that we got the linguistics out of the way and the definitions, let's go to the upsides of communism. There are upsides. First, communism is big on a social safety net. some social safety nets can have a net positive return on investment for everyone, just paying taxes into the social safety net. Why? Homelessness. Homelessness is nasty, even to not homeless people. So if you are purely selfish and you just don't like to see homelessness around because it's gross to the people living it, it's real gross. To you walking by with your rich guy hat, man, see, disgusting, man, and try to scoot them off with your cane, it's also gross to you. If we use some social safety net and make sure there are no homeless people, that generally seems to be a positive return on investment for everyone. So that seems like just a nearly correct answer. And yes, it's a little communist, it's a little socialist-like, but maybe that makes some sense. Another one is just from a perspective of an individual citizen or individual resident of a country, and if knowing that your government's got your back, if worse comes to worse and you can have some food and a place to stay and some basic medical care, knowing you'll never starve to death unless the whole society goes under, can be a huge stress reducer for the whole population, especially folks kind of at the bottom of their ability to produce wealth. And so at the very least, you don't have to lay awake at night thinking, Jesus Christ, what am I going to eat tomorrow? That might be handled for you. And that basic level of support from a government can be like an awesome social safety net to where it just actually liberates and empowers most people to do as good as they can without having to worry about this huge downside risk. Definitely a thing. Now, some social safeties are ROI relatively neutral, but it's got this emotional component, which is, I think, important for many people, that kind of a but if it were me kind of situation. So, for example, if, a lot of folks in your society that you run in regularly don't have the money for basic medical care and they just don't receive it, most people think that's a little bit fucked up. If there's people outside of hospitals or something just dying in the hospitals, like, no, they don't have money, see? No dollar bills, no care. Then I don't want to live in that world. Do you guys want to live in that world? I don't think anybody does. So like a basic support for folks that can't take care of themselves is a good thing. And that's kind of the last major point is some people, just through various genetic and environmental effects, just might not be able to care for themselves. And that maybe it's a proper role of government to step in and help them care for themselves. For example, very elderly people that have no one to turn to. You don't have children, or your children moved out of the country, or they're not alive anymore, or you had sullied relations with them. You're 89 years old. You really can't walk to the store anymore to get your food. And you live on a 5th floor, staircase only situation. It'd be nice if someone helped you, took care of you, make sure that you had some good years in left. It'd be really fucked up to know, there's tons of old people dying in that skyscraper. Gives a shit, fuck them. They'll clear them out. They'll let the cat eat it for a while and they'll clear it out. And that's really fucked up. Some people, and this is a point that Jordan Peterson kind of made a little bit famous when he touched on it very briefly. I'll get into it probably just as briefly as he did. The ability to produce enough wealth to pay for your basic needs is just a very simple math formula. It is your basic needs have been counted up by a variety of global organizations, World Health Organization, United Nations, and actually put a price tag on how much it costs to keep a person alive and basically housed and cared for with essential medicines on average per day. And it's just really not that much money. It's something like, $2,000, actually being very charitable here. It's like $2,000 a year for the average human to be able to produce enough wealth for themselves to take care of their basic needs. The thing is, IQ, for example, intelligence quotient, how much sense people can make out of their environments, how well they can intellectually problem solve in their environments, it lies on a normal distribution, which is most people around 100 of IQ. The standard deviation is 15, which means something like 2/3 of the people will be somewhere between 85 IQ and 115 IQ. Most of those people have absolutely no problem caring for themselves. They don't need socialized anything. They have enough intelligence in order to be able to modify the world around them so much that the marginal amount of value they create is much less than the value they consume. Assuming they're spending their money remotely well, look like we don't need to help people that just suck at spending money. Be like, motherfucker, fuck you. You're going to be spending money and you'll be on the street, or we'll be in a socialist encampment for homeless people or something. You probably don't want to be there, so just don't buy all your video games at the first of the month when you get paid. Save some money for later and you'll be totally fine. Almost every human being on earth is a net producer of value, not a net consumer. Almost every human. That doesn't mean everyone. You get below IQ 75, 70, 65, you get into the ranges of folks that, though they look like adults and often talk roughly like adults do, they are mentally incapable of handling the typical tasks associated with adulthood, including managing finances, executing any real job with any sort of complexity. They make a lot of mistakes. Sometimes the theoretical ultrastructure of the job is beyond them. Yes, there are people not sufficiently intelligent to understand even how the burger making process at McDonald's works. That's a real thing, where the interface of a microwave is too confusing for them to use effectively. They're just guessing, basically. And those folks are one of the benefits of the IQ scale as originally derived was as a mental age. And so IQ was referenced to your age and how old did it seem like you were intelligence-wise. So like an ultra high IQ 12-year-old may reason at the level of an 18-year-old. A normal IQ 12-year-old reasons about at the level you expect of a normal 12-year-old. A very low IQ 12-year-old reasons at something like maybe a 6-year-old reasons with. If someone's 18 to 20-something years of age, roughly in their fluid intelligence, they're relatively peaked, and they still have an IQ of 65 or 70 or something like that, they may have a rough mental age to someone who's somewhere between 10 and 14 years old. Now, I know plenty of 14-year-olds that are ultra responsible, some of these people actually help their families and run the household when they're 14. They generally are above average intelligence for 14-year-olds. The average 14-year-old probably can't run a household, but can maybe hold down a job and be okay and self-sufficient. But we're not talking about average. Here we're talking about folks that mentally age 14 or 13 or 12 or even younger. Now, imagine someone in an adult's body that has the mental age of a 10-year-old. They're capable of handling 10-year-old type problems. They're capable of abstracting no greater than a 10-year-old could. They have the emotional response of a 10-year-old, so they get upset really easily and very happy very easily. They instantly forget all their responsibilities when a good thing is presented to them. Like, 10-year-old, he could be like, "Did you do your homework, Jimmy?" He'd be like, "Nope, I'm about to get to it now." I'm like, "Hey, but we have tickets to SeaWorld." Jimmy doesn't give a fuck about homework anymore. He's out. He's going to SeaWorld. So if you're an adult, no one's helping you run your life, you're sufficiently low intelligence, you're essentially like a child out in the world. And we think it's wildly unethical to let children just roam around and try to make value in food and have jobs for themselves. It should just be roughly that unethical for us to be okay with people of severe intellectual disability going out in the world and doing things by themselves. And in this case, I hold Ayn Rand bullshit, all the free market, totally free thing can work at some distant future when we're insanely wealthy. But I think for now, it bears at least thinking about maybe these folks can be helped by the state to make sure that there's someone taking care of them. Another one is orphan children. Like if you're an orphan child, you don't have parents to take care of you anymore. You have no ability to produce value yourself. You probably need someone to take care of you. And I'm not interested in living in a world in which we just have orphan children fucking about. And you're like, "Yeah, what's that kid? He's a 4-year-old. Is he lost in the subway?" They're like, "No, he's not lost. He's just homeless. He's orphan by himself." We're like, "But we should help that kid." Like, "No, fuck him." Like, fuck that. That's insane. So there are absolutely use cases for socialism, specifically in sort of making sure that bottom end of a safety net works effectively, and that no one's either hungry or homeless or totally bereft of medical care, or they're so unable to care for themselves that nobody's going to come care for them, and they live in destitution. No thanks. Not in modern society. So those are the upsides. And that's kind of the thing that gets socialists in, or people who think about socialism and get into it politically, or they're drawn to it emotionally. So first of all, you might have heard me say this before, but almost all political leanings are purely emotional in nature. I know almost no one I've ever had political debates with to where the reason that they hold their opinion is a different interpretation of the technical data on the subject. I don't know, like that's happened like twice. Almost everyone who has very, very strong political views is feeling their way towards those views. And one of the things about socialism that people really feel their way towards is that appeal of the social safety. That's almost everyone, I think, who gets into socialism for the right reasons, which is most people. They get in there because they look at the poor and they look at the downtrodden and they look at the folks that can't care for themselves and the elderly, and they go, "Jesus fucking Christ, we got to help these people." And there's a rich guy fucking owns his own steamboat, and he's like, "Nah, see, and he doesn't need all that money, and fuck him," right? And there's a lot of heartfelt emotion there that's just fucking true. It's right. Like, you should disturb you to see that someone's fucking on their hands and knees, barely able to scrape by. 100%. I haven't met too many socialists that like socialism because on the technical grounds, it's an efficient way to run an economy where its long-term capacity for wealth production is higher, or anything like that, or aligns better with political theory. I haven't met hardly any socialists like that at all. Most people will sprinkle in justifications for it, but the real reason they're for it is that social safety net, which is why a lot of socialist, communist, whatever hard left folks in the United States, especially if you ask them like, well, what country is doing it well? Since it's not America, since we're evil capitalist bald eagles taking children off the street, evil Darth Vader's empire, what's the real way to do it? They're like, well, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, they do great. They're real socialist economies. It turns out that couldn't be further from the truth. Every single one of those economies has at least been, or is currently, more economically free than the United States. That's right. In most years, Denmark is more capitalist than the United States. It's a free economy, free market. They have less banking regulation, less trade regulation almost every year compared to the United States. There you go. And it throws a wrench into my bald eagle shit. Fuck is going on? What do they have in those countries? They have strong social safety nets. If we can do that, take that good from socialism, we can discard with all the bad from socialism and have the best of both worlds. And TLDR, kind of a preview, the Nordic countries do kind of have the best of both worlds, and a lot of other countries in the world do. And so now we have this modern consensus of how to properly run an economy, which takes the good stuff from socialism and leaves out the rest. So let's talk about the rest, what we're leaving out, the downsides. There are a few critical, quintessential downsides, non-starters to communism. To me, the biggest one, I'll list all the ones that I'm familiar with. Please list them in the comments if you have any. To me, the biggest thing about communism that's bad is that it is unable to efficiently allocate scarce resources that have alternative uses nearly as well as market-oriented price systems do. So you got freer markets and you got less free markets. You got more government control of the economy, you got less. Just on the numbers, you can treat these like two different kinds of cars. You got a 4-cylinder, you got an 8-cylinder. Which one cranks the horsepower harder? This answer there's no question about it. It's been something that's been solved in mainstream economics it was already solved before the Soviet Union collapsed in roughly 1991. But after the collapse and we got to see all the data from how the economies were actually faring, it's gone like an over-the-top mode of like, this is for sure a thing that communism definitely sucks ass at producing wealth and orienting the economy in such a way that is maximally efficient. And let me be very clear about something. A lot of people think efficiency and they think like robots telling you where to go and 9 to 5, and you look at your wife and it could be another person who cares. We're just all cogs in a wheel. Nonsense. Efficiency means less waste. Efficiency means that for everything the society tries to create, more of that benefits the people in the society. Straight up. Efficiency is good for everybody. Doesn't matter what you want. Efficiency is better for it in the economy. So because communism is so bad at scarcely allocating alternative uses, it makes huge problems with efficiency and thus keeps people poorer than they need to be at any one given time, and also greatly impacts the forward-looking economic growth prospects. So not only are communist countries poorer, everyone in the country is poorer, except for the people at the top. They always get by. It doesn't matter what economy structure you have. Not only are these countries poorer, but the rate at which they're increasing their wealth and thus their per capita income is also much lower. Freer market, more capitalist countries, not only are they richer, but they also grow faster. And so in the long run, 10, 20, 30 years, choosing your country as communist versus as relatively free market is a huge impact on actual people's lives. Let me give you some examples. I've taken some indices of economic freedom from the Heritage Foundation. I've tried to pair them to countries to do like versus like comparison. Here's the first one. China versus Taiwan. If you did a 23andMe between Chinese people and Taiwanese people, you would quickly find out that's the same thing. Like literally the same fucking people. The people of Taiwan generally, or a huge fraction of them, are kind of the folks that lost to the communist revolution in China and just went to Taiwan. So they're like the pro-capitalist people in China. And they're fucking Chinese people. They're Han Chinese, almost the same genetics, same subgenetics, same all that shit. Their culture is almost identical. They speak the literal same language, Mandarin Chinese. China is a megalith super producer, right? That's how you think of China. Huge fucking massive land, crapload of resources. I mean, industry upon industry. They manufacture seemingly everything in the world. They have fucking 1.5 or 2 billion fucking people, and these are fucking Chinese people. You ever work with Chinese people? Them motherfuckers are productive as shit. They're peaceful, unbelievable, right? You think China got every fucking advantage. Then we look at Taiwan. They got all the good stuff going for it, but there's a fucking tiny little island in the middle of the fucking South China Sea, really teeny tiny. They don't really have a ton of natural resources, and it's kind of like, oh, well, of course this little pathetic island, according to you would expect people think is economic theory, which it's not. Natural resources are insanely overblown in modern economics. Or in modern economics, we understand natural resources get you some way, but not very far. Most people think that's a huge important thing. Do you say most people, like, which one of these countries, given that you know nothing about them except one is, 50 times bigger and has, 20 times the number of people, even more, which one's going to be wealthier? And say, of course, China, right? The per capita income of China, real quick. The index of economic freedom for China in this year, this is 2023, was just under 50, 48. The index of economic freedom, the higher the number, the better. For Taiwan is 80, just over 80, 80.7. So 30-point spread is fucking enormous. Most countries are somewhere between 40 and 80. And 60 is kind of the middle ground of those two. Anything below 40, as we'll see later, is just a dilapidated hell. And anything in the 80 range and above is like basically paradise, right? But sort of knowing that, China's a 48 or 50 versus 80 is a huge difference. And China's been economically less free in the past, a little bit more free in the recent past, but has kind of sunk back down. So China's history is one of largely much lower economic freedom than Taiwan's, whose history is almost exclusively of relatively high economic freedom, especially lately. The per capita income, per person income in China is about $20,000 a year. In Taiwan, no natural resources, really, fucking little island, China's always aggressing militarily, is just over $60,000 a year. That's 3 times higher. If you're pro-communist, you got a big, huge fucking problem. But don't worry, your problems have just begun. East versus West Germany. Unfortunately, this is not pre-modern, but pre-internet, so we don't have any formal index of economic freedom stuff. We do know that East Germany was part of the Eastern Bloc, so it had a very repressed economy, low index of economic freedom if it was measured, and West Germany was a modern Western European country, as high an index of economic freedom as modern unified Germany has today. Again, same language, same culture, same everything, just 2 different economic systems. At the time that the Berlin Wall fell, roughly in the late 80s, the average East German made $9,000 a year. The average West German made $20,000 a year. Guys, these aren't like one made 9 and one made 11, so it's nuance. There's no fucking nuance here. This is like orders of magnitude higher, not quite orders of magnitude, multiples higher. This is a huge deal. The most extreme example I'll give today, I'll give some after this, North versus South Korea. North Korea is the most repressed economy of all time. It is the most communist in a sense, but they gave up on redistribution a long time ago, so now it's just totalitarian hell. Don't worry, I'll get to why that is later. Most communist countries end up going in that direction by design. Not by intention, but by design. North Korea's index of economic freedom is 2.9, not 20.9, 2.9. Remember, anything below 40 is low. 2.9 is unheard of, except in North Korea. And there's no financial data because they're not in the global economy and they don't publish financial data. Everything they publish is state propaganda and fucking lies. But they have regular starvation, which means oftentimes their per capita income is under $2,000 per person per year. $2,000 per person per year or less. You can't have intermittent starvation otherwise because it's more money than you would have starvation with. Versus South Korea. Funny. North Korea, South Korea, the literal same people, the same language up until like 70 years ago, the same history too. They just cut that motherfucker right down the line. And South Korea has an index of economic freedom of 73.7 last year, which is very high. And it has an average per capita income of $48,500 a year, 48.5 versus 2. And curiously enough, the more extreme the communism is, or the economic repression, the government's attempt to control the economy, the more poor the people are. And that's something we see holding all the time. Next up, go into a different part of the world. Venezuela versus Chile. As far as natural resources, as far as integration of the global economy, Venezuela had every single advantage. Also, Venezuelans were technically trained, really fucking smart people, really well educated, the whole gamut. But they decided, let's do some communism. And so last year, the index of economic freedom for Venezuela was 25.8 versus Chile, which Chile is actually on paper, this is part of the funny business of nomenclature, Chile's government on paper is a socialist government. But when you look at why, it was the rebellion against the Augusto Pinochet thing, and Augusto Pinochet set up the financial and economic structures that have benefited Chile so well, but he also did a lot of murder without trial, which is bad, of course. So it's kind of a yin and yang type of situation. Nowadays, Chile calls themselves socialist, but on the metrics, they're actually an insanely free market. They're a highly capitalist country. Their index of economic freedom is 71.1. So we're talking about roughly 70 versus roughly 26 for Chile versus Venezuela. Venezuela's average income is just over $5,000 a year per person. And in Chile, it's roughly $26,000 a year per person. 5 times the amount. All in Latin America. Next up, Vietnam versus Thailand. Very, very curious story. Vietnam historically has had an index of economic freedom something between 40 and 50 because they're a nominally, in name, communist country, and they still are. But recently, Vietnam has been liberalizing its markets because they were like, this doesn't work. We're going to try to make some money. And they piece by piece have been liberalizing markets, freeing up markets. And now Vietnam actually has an index of economic freedom that's 61.8, which is actually really good. Really good. To put this in perspective, Spain has an index of economic freedom of 65. So we're talking about a very kind of Central European type of average economic freedom for the Vietnamese now. But historically, for a long, long time, up until very recently, it was in the 40s and 50s. Compare that to Thailand, who now has sunk down to an index of economic freedom of just 60.6, below Vietnam. So Thailand's right here, Vietnam's right here now. But historically, for decades, it's been 60 to 70 in Thailand, very economically free. So what we're measuring, economic freedom doesn't have an instant effect on wealth. That would be impossible. But it has a long-running years and years and decades effect. Vietnam's average per capita income is roughly 11,000 per year. In Thailand, it's roughly 19,000. So almost double. But very interesting, because now Vietnam has a higher index of economic freedom. Thailand has a slightly lower one. If we look at growth rates, Vietnam is doing over 5% a year now. It didn't used to do that shit when it was more communist. And Thailand is down to a 1.2% per year. So sometimes when countries are free for a long time, the voters kind of take it for granted that things are always good. They get a little communism, a little socialism sprinkling going into the government. Shit starts to suck, or at least flatline for a while. Other countries start to supersede them and they go, fuck, we're behind. And then they liberalize again. Part of the cycle of development of life on Earth. A little tragic because we could all just be going a straight line into economic liberalization and huge wealth for everyone. But, that's the reality of how that's going. Next, even within the context of Europe, we have Spain, we have Sweden, both ultramodern economies, both have generations of wealth creation, intellect, etc. These are standard bearers here. Spain has a 65, Sweden has a 77.5, which is almost always higher than that of the United States. So Sweden is significantly more capitalist than Spain. Roughly 40,000 average income for Spain, roughly 60,000 average income per year for Sweden. That's fucking big. Big difference, notable difference. Cuba versus Costa Rica. Cuba's been communist a long time, has an index of economic freedom of about 25. Costa Rica has an index of economic freedom of about 65. It's not been free for terribly long, but quite a while now. Cuba has a 13,000 per year average income. That number I would take with a big grain of salt because a lot of it's published by the Cuban authorities and they lie as a matter of principle. The Costa Rica indices report that 22,000 per year. So still roughly $10,000, $9,000 more per year for Cuba versus Costa Rica. And Cuba is a place that has an insanely talented workforce, a huge history of productive outlays. Costa Rica, not so much, but they're already way better than Cuba. And that's because, free markets work really well. We could go on and on. I could do this for another 2 hours. Let's take kind of the main points from this. Any way you treat the data, economically freer countries are superior in per capita wealth almost all the time. It's a correlation that's insanely high. When you instantiate a higher degree of economic freedom in a country, you almost always get the following historical relationship. First, income inequality rises. as the people best positioned to create wealth with the new system get skyrocket super fast wealth. Then over a longer time, the floor, the bottom 25% of people are empowered and finally get to see some real results from that increased economic liberty, and then they start to come up real fast. So income inequality climbs substantially at first in a liberalization of a country, but then income inequality actually tends to decline over the long term as everyone becomes what is by global standards insanely wealthy. At no point in the cycle, on objective, absolute measures, do higher economic freedom policies hurt the actual poor on net balance. In other words, at no point during economic liberalization on a time horizon of 5, 10, 15, 20 years, etc., are the poor being made worse off. In almost every case, if you do the economy properly and you liberalize it slowly with progressive measures, you end up having a situation where the poorest people, not much happens, and then they start to go like that. But during that time, the richest people go whoop, and then the poor people kind of meet them towards the end several decades later. That's how it works in pretty much every economy it's ever been tried. So market-oriented economies, freer economies, one in which the government has marginally less control over the economy, are superior on average also in just about anything else positive you can measure. Cleanliness, crime, social freedom, acceptance of homosexuality and transgenderism and treating them as normal human beings, race relations. Almost everything improves with higher economic freedom index countries. You go to a place like Australia, one of the freest economies in the world, New Zealand, Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, Canada, the United States. These are places people desperately try to go. They're just better. And if you ask it what, the answer is everything. Versus places like Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, fucking, China if you're not ultra rich. You don't want to go to these places. These places kind of suck. What do they suck at? At everything. Except for oppression, I guess. They're pretty good at that. But even that, they're not doing so impressively. In any case, in mainstream economics, who won the war? Was it free market versus communism? That debate ended a long time ago. As far as science can be definitive, only on the margins, it's pretty close to a closed case. Market-oriented economies, to the extent that they are more market-oriented, and the top-end limit we haven't found yet, there is no documented economy that's ever been so free that it's caused negatives. To the extent that an economy is more free, it has more prosperity and more of all the good things that we all as humans agree are good. So that's just the fact of the matter. And that's a huge downside for communism. So if you're trying to get the world together, hey, you guys want to do communism? They're like, yeah, what are the upsides? Like social safety net, everyone's taken care of. Like, sweet. What are the downsides? Like, none of us really get wealthier that much faster. And some of us will stay poor for a very long time. Like, well, that sucks. Yes, it's a huge concern. Now, why is it a huge concern? Do we really just need a lot of rich people? No, fuck them. Fuck the rich. I'll be the first to say it. However, wealth is the thing you help people with. Imagine you are walking in this, Witcher style fucking enchanted forest. You haven't eaten in days. You haven't drank water in days. You're to the brink. And you come upon a household, a little cabin, and you knock on the door. And you're like, please help, and you collapse. If that cabin has the wealth of the typical household of, let's say, Sweden, they got hella food, they got fresh water, they can call the hospital. If you're meant to live, you're going to live. You knocked on the right fucking door. If that house happens to have the average household wealth of North Korea, they're like, hey, you look just like us. And you're like, do you guys have water or food? They're like, we have water from the well. You might get sick drinking it, no big deal, but you won't die. And they're like, what about food? And they're like, yeah, we were thinking maybe you had some food. Nobody fucking has food. It's very hard to come by. So it's nice emotionally to want to help other people, but you have to understand that help is what wealth actually does. You have to be wealthy to help because wealth is allowing you the literal things of help: food, medical care, clothing, a place to live. Wealth is the thing that creates all of them. Redistribution is a meaningless concept if you don't have wealth. Let me give you another example, unrelated, but nonetheless as analogically very similar, just to get you guys thinking. If you want to stand up, let's say you watch a trans person at the store, just get straight physically bullied by this jacked, no offense conservatives, you guys take jokes really well, fucking MAGA hat wearing, like, motherfucker, what gender are you, pussy, pushing them and shit. What are you going to do about it? Well, here's the thing. Imagine there's no police force for a second. The police are 20 minutes out and there's no way you're going to save this person in time with the police. They don't matter. How are you going to help them? How are you going to stand up for them? What you going to do? You going to pull your phone out and start recording it? They're still getting beat to death. You're going to carry on your face between them and get knocked the fuck out, and then the trans person gets knocked the fuck out? No. In order to help someone from physical harm, you need to have physical capacity. You need to have a wealth of power. So if you have a concealed carry, you'd be like, hey, Donald Trump, turn around. Cut it out. I'm going to draw on you. Step the fuck back. Everyone knows what that means. That guy is a gun carrier too. He's like, okay, just got out of my lane a little bit. You put your hand on the holster. That's some real shit right there. Or, MMA or some shit like that. And you're like, you fucking yell at that person one more time, I'm going to dislocate your fucking jaw off your face. And they might not believe you. And then you dislocate their jaw. And then all of a sudden you save the person in order to help those that are most needy. Here's another, who helps the needy? Superman. Why is it Superman, not just some homeless guy from the street? Couldn't he help? Isn't Superman kind of ableist? Ability is the ultimate thing. Wealth is the ultimate thing. It's the thing which you drain down to help other people. So if you really want to organize a society in which the poorest, most vulnerable people are helped the most, your absolutely number one concern should be that the rest of society that isn't hopeless and not able to care for itself is producing the maximum amount of wealth possible. Such that if you're like, hey, can I get a little bit of resources to help the poor? Like, fuck yeah, hell yeah. Versus if they're ultra poor and everyone's poor, it's like resources from where? North Korea could be communist on paper. Everyone's just equally poor. No one can help anyone because no one can do shit. No one has wealth. But if you have a country like Sweden, there's so many wealthy people that they easily take care of their poor. You fucking watch a documentary about Swedish jail. It's ridiculous. It's better than my fucking house I live in. Like, that's what you can do with wealth. Wealth is the ultimate helper. Intentions to help are secondary, because with intentions to help, you can't help. With a lot of wealth, you can help. And then the intention is the easy part. So this is why low economic freedom countries have worse outcomes on almost all of these variables of how well they help the poor, how well they tend to their environment, because all those things cost money. And they don't have a lot of money because they're not busy creating wealth. They're busy worrying about who gets the wealth, which is a very, very important concern, very secondary to who makes the wealth. It's like being on a basketball team and wondering about who's getting the ball more often and who's getting a chance to score. If you're dominant and you're winning all the time, that's a fine discussion to have. If you're losing, shut the fuck up. It doesn't matter who gets the fucking ball. You guys all suck. Who gives a shit? I give you the ball, you fucking get swatted out. I give you the ball, you get hurt. Somebody's got to produce on here, and then we can worry about is the ball being redistributed. Absolutely. On the other hand, long-time free countries that are, because they're long-time free, they're insanely wealthy, they're the best at handling everything that socialists ideally want to handle on paper. So for example, the Nordic countries, the rich Asian countries like Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Switzerland, these countries are the ones that have all of the features of progressive, super advanced socialism as envisioned by the founders. There's, if you're homeless, if you're sick, if you can't eat, if you can't take care of yourself, they got you handled 50 different ways with a ton of care, crap load of money is thrown your way. That's awesome, but where do these guys get their wealth? These are the economies of the world which have the most unregulated machines of wealth generation and capitalism. That's how they get their money, and then they help. So the ultimate combination of socialism and capitalism isn't so socialism or communism is the thing and capitalism gets kicked out, nor is it only capitalism and there's no care for the poor or whatever. It's probably like huge emphasis on capitalism, generate as much wealth as possible, and then a small but concerted effort on making sure some of that wealth is intelligently siphoned off to do the things that socialism sets out to do that are the best features of that system, to help those who cannot help themselves or help those who are in emergencies. Next, downside of communism. It creates massive incentives to cheat the system to get ahead. This isn't the case in most market economies nearly that much. If you ask yourself, how do you make the most money in a market economy? There's only one answer to that question. That's correct. It's start a business and make sure it's successful. Even if your business is a personal brand, that's your business. And the way that businesses become successful over the long term is providing more value to people than the people have in their dollars. So if the Coca-Cola company makes a shitty soft drink, I don't buy it. They don't get any money. But if they make a super awesome, tasty, refreshing beverage, easily I'll pay a couple dollars and I'll get a Coke and I win. So in free market economies, ambition to become ultra wealthy and ultra powerful is concordant with, largely, the production of value for everyone else. Like, why the fuck is Bill Gates so rich? Because he Him and his team invented Microsoft Excel, and the rest of the world made, I don't know, trillions of dollars off that. Bill Gates got some chump change billions. Fuck him. That's great. I want people with Bill Gates' ambition and intelligence to do what they do in capitalism. Elon Musk is like a world leader type of guy. What does he do? He makes like electric cars and robots and shit like that. That's amazing. And he sells it to people for a very small amount of money relative to how amazing that technology is. What about communism? How do you get ahead in communism? Well, you're not allowed to make any more money than a certain point. There's a huge cap on income. And your ambition and hard work isn't really so much rewarded, even philosophically in communism. They're kind of looked at as not such a great thing. And so how do you get ahead? There's this very, very strict system of rules. And in order to generate the most wealth for yourself and the most influence, you actually, that all happens outside the system. So if you can rig the system to your advantage, that's how you benefit. If you rig the system to your advantage in the market, the price system figures you out and all of a sudden you don't have shit. Like if you're selling computer components that don't work and you're like, yeah, we rigged the system. See, you'll sell a few of them and then the company will be like, these don't work. And then you're going to be like, well, you guys want more? And they're going to be like, no. And then you don't have any money. In communism, it's all committees and approval and political finagling. If you can futz the system a little bit, if you can take some money in off the top end to yourself, then it's really the system incentivizes. That's kind of the only way to do an outlay for your motivation and for your successful venture. So the people that do the best in communism, generally ones that can manipulate the system the best. That's not what you want out of a system. The people that do generally the best in capitalism are ones that just like generate value for other people, and that's well within the confines of the system. This situation causes, over time, massive cultures of corruption. One of the biggest elements to a corruption culture is people think that the corruption is just business as usual, and you'd have to be a dummy not to do it. Like in many of these countries, if you get pulled over by a police officer, you just pay them off and off you go. And is that considered unethical? Nobody cares because that's just how it works. If you're well tuned in and seeded into a corruption culture, even if you transition to a mostly free market economy, that baggage of that culture is so destructive, so deleterious, so much prevents people from cooperating together. It can lag your country behind for a long time. Elements of East German corruption culture have been noted 20 years later after the unification of the Germanies as being keeping down incomes and life successes of East Germans. It's a big deal. Russia, enormous culture of corruption. I'm from Russia. My parents spent half their lives in Russia. I spent the first 7 years of my life. In Russia, there were two types of people. People that took advantage of the system, fucking chumps, period. There was nobody hardworking, making success for themselves within the rules because the rules did not allow success. Because communism says success is way overrated and what you do is just do your job, you get paid your little meager amount, and then you go live your proletariat, bourgeois, whatever the fuck life. So the people that wanted the most success, they took matters in their own hands. That incentivized corruption like crazy. China, you Google some stories of corruption from China. A lot of Chinese folks, companies, et cetera, are impossible to work with because they lie at every single step. And it's not so much like a bad thing as much as an expected thing. You spend your whole life, generations of it, lying to the government and to everyone around you to get your little way. And all of a sudden people are like, oh, it's the market. You're supposed to be honest. Really? That never worked for us before. So once the culture is there, it's really tough. Ukraine war is going on right now. People complain of a huge culture of corruption in Ukraine. Yeah, where the fuck you guys think they got that? Fucking 80 years of communism. That'll do that to a country. Belarus, same idea, same 80 years of communism, same system. Venezuela, huge corruption problems, also communist, Cuba, and so on and so on and so on. So one of the big problems with communism is that it creates incentives to play unfairly. Now, here's the thing. All humans should do better. In any given system, all humans have the ability to resist the incentives that pull them. But you also have to think about humans are just human. They're malleable, soft things. They err. They make mistakes. They generally go with the flow. They go with the easiest gradient. And they're not always heroic in their actions. So given the similar amount of human worth, if you put humans into an environment in which success is a matter of cheating the system, you're going to get a lot of people that cheat the system and a culture that develops around that's being a good idea. Whereas if you put the same identical humans into a culture where it's like, don't cheat the system, just do your best and you'll get paid as much good work as you do, then all of a sudden more people have that culture and then they just do better. So it's not an either or, it's not a 1-0 communism versus capitalism, but freer economies generally support cultures of mutual cooperation and prosperity more than communist countries, which generally support more cultures of like, ratting out your neighbors and trying to finagle your own thing where you get a little money off the top of a couple of the industries you work in, and corruption's the way to go. Huge, huge problem. Next, Problem. Communism can create moral hazards on the side of transfer recipients. If working harder isn't rewarded, like as soon as you get to be a janitor, this is your cap. My dad was a physicist. I remember he made the same money as a janitor in Russia. Figure that one out. Maybe just low demand for physicists. I don't know. They didn't do supply and demand. Don't worry. They just made up those prices. If my dad was 10 times the physicist he would make any extra money. There was no corporations to go to make semiconductors for anything like that. Corporations didn't exist. If working harder has a huge cap and anything above that isn't rewarded, and innovation's not rewarded, like how do we reward innovation? Well, if you innovate, you get a real big disproportionate amount of money. That fuels innovation like crazy. Also, a lot of people innovate in their personal spare time, but there's levels to innovation. Let me give you an example. You can have a eureka idea in a fucking communist country. Plenty of people have. But one idea by itself, even one invention by itself, is good. It's a good start, but it's not the whole thing. True advancement in standards of living are involved when you have an innovation that you've created and the incentive structure for you is so massive to make that innovation better and more effective and actually deal with consumers' concerns. The more you attend to taking that innovation and plugging it into and expanding it into the rest of society such that it's a functioning machine for other people, like the car or the computer or the cell phone or the internet or the iPhone, whatever you have it, whatever innovation we're talking about, the more you make that innovation useful, the more money you get. I mean, Bill Gates innovated like crazy, Steve Jobs, et cetera. They got like fucking billions of dollars, right? Like that's what we want. Not because rich people need any more billions. Fuck them. Who gives a shit? It's the fact that they're so psychotically motivated by not 10 times more money, not 100 times more money, like almost an infinite times more money. They will push these megalith projects and take their whole lives to get that innovation actually instantiated in the market. That's the kind of innovation that fucking counts. I don't want to go to a museum and see an example of the Soviet Union developed a cell phone. I want to go to the Soviet Union and see where the fuck their GSM network is. Do you guys have a cell network? It operates with reasonable prices and good service. That was never the case when I was there. It was never the case after. They imported all their cell phone tech from the West. The communists never actually built a functioning cell phone ultrastructure because nobody was incentivized not to work hard, not to work harder, to give their life to something like that. True innovators making not just good ideas, but layering on top of those ideas and making those ideas work with the rest of the economy, spend lifetimes doing that. I'm a nobody. I make 2 apps, but I've given so much of myself to making the shit I do for RP. For sure took years off my life. Crazy amount of stress. It's all on me all the time. That incentivized me like crazy, in part because, well, the money's kind of fucking absurd. If the money wasn't kind of fucking absurd, to be honest with you guys, I would just coach. I would just do an online coach. I'm already famous. I get a lot of money doing that. I would never bother making apps. What happened with apps? Now we have the diet app and we have the hypertrophy app. People who can spend roughly $2 a day and all of their diet and all their training is completely handled by a machine that learned from a sports scientist. Oh my fucking God. It's pat myself on the back, but in the grand sense of what we do in the 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera, this is a fucking miracle. It's nonsense. It's madness. Where do you get that kind of innovation? Precisely in the places that reward an obscene amount of effort, way overkill, because the upside's basically infinite. If you cap the upside, you'll still have innovation, for sure. Way less of it, and on way less grandiose scales, which is exactly what you see in communist countries in practice. Now, some people might go to the extreme and just might produce nothing at all or sandbag like crazy, and that hurts everyone else. Like if you get paid to go to work and you get paid the same and you can't get fired, whether or not you do a good job or just you do a basic, decent job and no one's touching you, but you can't make any more money. If you do really well, you can't make any less. If you do like much more poorly, you just get the same amount of money. What the fuck is your incentive to work super hard and be a great person and really go above and beyond? There is no incentive like that. What's your incentive even to do a decent job? Well, if you don't get fired for non-decent work, there is no incentive anymore. Not all people, most people aren't this fucked up, but a lot of people are like, fuck it, I'm just going to do the bare minimum or hardly nothing at all, get paid and invest more in my hobbies or more in leisure. Since this is not an outlay that has an ability to multiply for me, why the fuck would I do it? The evidence from large-scale application of communism, nationwide especially and across nations and across history, hugely and definitively says this is a big deal. There is some limited UBI, universal basic income evidence, that says the alteration of incentive structures is not a big deal, but several thousand people here and there doesn't combine to several billion people all over Earth for all of economic history. So the evidence is very much still hugely in favor of the idea that moral hazards in communism and in social safety nets really are a real thing that require huge concern. Also, the UBI is very different from communism in a very, very specific way. If you don't do anything at all, you still get paid your universal basic income. Fucking sweet. But if you take another job and you do more on top of that, you get more money. So the upside is still there, which is a huge deal. In communism, there's generally no upside. If you do really, really good work, the probability that you'll be promoted is nominal. Maybe you'll get promoted, but that just gives you more responsibility. Do you make more money? No, everyone's supposed to make the same amount. So if I make the same amount, just doing my own bullshit job 8 hours a day and I go home, chill with my family, or if I make the same amount, but spend 14 hours at work architecting these huge systems to make a lot of people cooperate in really beneficial ways, what's my payout? Passion, I guess. But remember, people who do things just for passion, they go a long way. People who do things for passion plus profit, they go all the fucking way. So huge thing that you're missing out on in that case. Lastly, this is one of the biggest deals. Communism centralizes power, which means it gives a lot of power to very few people. And communism places a very small emphasis on individual liberties and the restraint of government. There's a lot of stuff governments of free countries just can't do to you without a crap load of due process and annoyance. Right? The United States government is not just allowed to pluck you off the street for no reason at all. Communist governments, they own you, that they can pluck you off the street anytime. When you give a lot of people that much unchecked power, very quickly, the people that are attracted to this sort of thing are psychopaths, sociopaths, megalomaniacs. Now they're in charge. They don't give up on power. In almost every communist country ever tried, even if the attempt was democratic at first, democracy lasts for a few elections, sometimes not even, and then one person gets put in charge, and they don't leave. We're talking about Stalin, we're talking about Mao, we're talking about Pol Pot, we're talking about all that shit. Communism is almost designed in its incentive structure to grow dictatorships and to grow oppressive totalitarian regime. That's why in almost every instance of real, true attempt at communism, China, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, East Germany, North Korea, Vietnam, the list goes on, what you get is a despotic totalitarian government, essentially by design. Whereas if your design is for limited government, more democratically determined policies, but the policies are very constrained, a high degree of individual liberty for all people, those places tend to do much better. Sweden, Norway, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, almost every country of Europe, they do just much better because the probability of everything slipping into totalitarian hell is really low. Now, something to say here. The ability to code for totalitarianism and for oppression and despotism isn't unique to communism. It's actually unique to every social structure ever tried until we tried a limited constitutional republic. It's the only thing that's worked so far reasonably well. Feudalism, monarchies and shit, they were all despotic. Communism is just a continuation of that trend. So communism codes for, in its design, by centralizing power, by having very few limits to power, enough to really catch those goddamn billionaires and get their money. You give a government that much power to expropriate wealth from everyone. Now they got all the wealth. Now they're in charge. And they don't want to go anywhere. They like wealth. Remember, everybody likes wealth, writ large, period. And when communist leadership gets enough wealth and power, like Xi Jinping now has in China, they don't typically like to give it up. They don't. And then someone else has a freedom political movement, so they just go and shoot all of them or imprison the rest because I'm not trying to deal with that bullshit. I fucking won. It was a race to the top. I found myself there. I'm shutting down the whole fucking thing. That's how communism works. So the ultimate point to make about how big of a deal this is that the vast majority of these communist countries in history had bans on emigration. I want you guys to really think about this and realize how big of a deal it is. If you live in the United States, if you live in Sweden, if you live in Australia, if you live in New Zealand, if you live in Canada, if you live in Taiwan, if you live in South Korea, you can pack up your shit any day, buy a one-way ticket the fuck out of your country to anywhere you want. Nobody gives a fuck. There's not even a person at the airport that asks you where you're going. The TSA people never ask me where I'm going. They're just like, driver's license. I give it to them. They're like, you're ugly. I'm like, I know. Anyway, here you go. They're not like, sometimes they're like, where are you headed to? Boston. But it doesn't matter what you tell them. They don't give a fuck. If I said, I'm going to Japan, they'd be like, okay. If I told a TSA agent, I'm going to Japan because things got really tough here in America, politically, they'd be like, I hear you, bud. Here's your passport. And off you go. And if you don't come back from that country, nobody's coming to look for you. There's not an association of the Swedish government, which is like, where are all our Swedish citizens? Did Fjorgen Lorgen Borgen make it back? 6 months ago, he said he was leaving. He better be back, damn it. He's on Team Sweden. Nobody's coming to look for you. The entire idea is insane. In a huge fraction of communist countries during history, I think pretty close to all of them, you're not allowed to leave. And if you leave, you're supposed to say when you get back. Sometimes you have a formal escort. And in most cases, that's just for tourism. You're not allowed to emigrate. You're considered fleeing. You're a refugee at that point. When we left the Soviet Union, my family and I, they tore up our passports in front of us. We were never welcome to come back again. What the fuck? And we were fleeing. We had special permission from America because we were Jews and they were starting to kill us off like they do every now and again there when they get jealous. We're just better at shit. Real talk. That was it. We were out. We were running away. Almost everyone you ever met from Vietnam, communist China, Cuba, etc., they ran. Cuban people actually got on fucking homemade life rafts and fucking booked it 90 miles across the treacherous fucking Atlantic Ocean to Florida to get the fuck away from Cuba. But why couldn't they just get on a plane and fly over? Because it was illegal for them to leave. I'll put this very mildly and then I'll move on with the rest of my talk, which is almost coming to an end. If your country forces people to stay, it sucks. If your country doesn't force you to stay and says you can come back anytime, it's probably a lot better because they know you're coming back. When I go on vacation from America where I live, they know I'm coming back. Also, they don't care, but they know because America's the fucking shit. It's not perfect, but it's fucking way better than where the fuck I go on vacation. The other way is not true. So the ultimate indictment of the morality and real consequential effect of communism is communist countries, almost as a rule, are places from which it is illegal to leave. If it is illegal to leave from a place where you live in a jail. And any ethics or morality of how communism is superior has to contend with that first. And don't worry, there's no contending with it. Enjoy yourself in the comments. All right, last few points. 4 points on the way forward, kind of synthesizing all the upsides and downsides of communism. I think most of us can agree, I certainly agree, and hopefully you agree with me, that what we'd like to see from society is kind of similar stuff among all of us. Nobody's against clean streets. Nobody's against no one going hungry. Everyone's against no homeless people. Everyone has a home to go to, a place of residence. Everyone should be going to school and having basic health care. Nobody disagrees with that. Communists, capitalists, everyone's in the opinion that, yeah, that's the really good stuff that we want for everyone. Now, before we say how do we structure society so that gets us to that, we're going to hold off a second and re-examine what it is that generates wealth. All those things I just said, they require wealth. Someone has to be producing value for us to take some of that and help people who can't help themselves. If there's not a huge value production and everyone's poor as fuck, what are you going to do? Take from one guy to give to the other? That guy dies and that guy lives. That doesn't make any goddamn sense, right? It's like everyone on your basketball team sucks at playing basketball. Who are you going to ask for advice on the team? Like, can you watch my jump shot? Like, I don't know how to do a jump shot. Like, oh my God, we all suck. If only we had some people on here who could fucking play ball, they could use their surplus knowledge to help the rest of us lifting everyone up. So it's all about that surplus. It's all about wealth creation. We need to understand that markets are usually just way superior, especially in the long term, via innovation and allocation of scarce resources. They're just better at generating wealth. That is the very huge and ever-growing pie from which we slice out our nice communist intentions of helping the poor. So we have to be very concerned with, as caring people, as left-wing people, to effectively bring market mechanisms to bear on as much social good chasing as we can, both to generate wealth and also to run the systems. Sometimes market-oriented ways of helping the poor are just better because market-oriented systems, with their reliance on prices, just allocate resources better for almost any task whatsoever. Now, point number 3, for anything that markets can't do super well, we can try to do through government. But we have to be very, very careful and do what's called good governance, which is a topic I'll cover on this channel at some point later. Create policies that are designed and overseen to have maximum effect with minimum perverse incentives and minimum corruption and minimum drift of incentives, where like you started this agency to do something, but now it kind of does something else and it doesn't really help anybody. This is a big deal. A lot of people think of government as a fix-all. You just give government money and it fixes the problem. Anyone who thinks that should go examine the homelessness situation in San Francisco, where last my update occurred, roughly $90,000 per homeless person per year was being spent by the government. But $90,000 is enough to get someone into a housing complex to get them a staff of assistants and all the food and entertainment they'll ever need the rest of their lives, if 90,000 a year is what we're talking about. So how come that hasn't been solved? Because governments generally suck dick at solving problems. But that's not true everywhere. Governments in Sweden, in Finland, in Taiwan, their organizations work better. So we can work to better government and make sure that we are aware of the fact that governments don't come with solutions. They come with their own trade-offs. Sometimes those trade-offs are better than the ones just the market gives us, but they also have externalities. They also have lots of bumps in the road. So it's not good enough for us to be like, all right, the market does most of the shit. The shit it can't do, we do through government. Just sweet government, take care of it. No. Government is usually incentivized very poorly to do things very well. The government is just a worse way of handling almost everything than the market. The market is just straight up superior. So if the market is not built for purpose for handling something, you don't just look at government and go, oh, don't worry, government's going to have this handled. It's like, okay, how do we make this program super well overseen, incentivized, and constructed such that it gives us marginally better returns over time? And because it's really well overseen, we make sure that we're always on the outlook for corruption. We're always on the outlook for grift. We're always on the outlook to make sure that this good thing that we're doing started out good and is still good over time and maybe even better over time after that. Lastly, we want to have as big of a fraction as we can of our economy be free. Very minimum intelligent, but minimum regulations, largely free market, so that it can generate as much wealth as possible. You take that wealth that's ever growing. You take a relatively low tax rate off of it. Why low? Most of that wealth is better used in the economy as a whole to make everyone happy and the economy even wealthier. So you want to leave most of the fuck of it alone. And take a small slice, percentage-wise, and you take that slice and you feed it into the kind of caregiving socialist services that make all of society better off. Feeding the homeless, sheltering them, taking care of the very poor, of the elderly, of children, and all that good stuff. And because you never took too big of a slice of the pie to reduce the growth rate, this huge bubble fueled by innovation and freedom and greed, really, is always expanding. And so your maybe 20% slice of the pie that you get to do government services with, yes, it's always 20%. It never goes up. But the absolute amount of money, another way of putting it, the absolute amount of resources to help the less fortunate always grows, because 20% of a billion is dope. 20% of a trillion is way more fucking dope. As economies grow over time, we as caring people who care about those that cannot help themselves have to be number one concerned with expanding wealth. Number two concern is that some small slice of that gets to where it's supposed to. And the number three concern is once we have that wealth transferred to those people, we're doing it in a way that minimizes moral hazards, maximizes human flourishing, and prevents corruption and all that stuff from taking hold. If we can do that, we get the best of capitalism, we get the best of communism, and together they make Sweden and New Zealand and all these other fucking incredible places that everyone wants to live, and they're just better than the rest of the world. If we combine them poorly, we get China, which is not a place most people want to live. And if we don't combine them at all, and we do a lot of communism, well, you get like, I don't know, Turkmenistan or something. Actually, my dad's from there. Don't go there. It's not a good place to visit. Anyway, folks, thanks for tuning in. Let me know what you think in the comments and have fun debating. Peace.